Hello, everybody, and welcome to the recording of the Introduction to Teaching BTEC International Level 2 in Engineering. This session is going to last for approximately 2 hours, and we're going to go through all the key aspects of delivery required for the Level 2 in Engineering qualification. This is for international colleagues only, and we'll be referring to the documentation that relates to the international version of this specification. My name is Simon Clark. I've been a teacher for over 30 years, teaching BTEC qualifications at Level 2, Level 3, Level 4, and Level 5, as well as a range of other qualifications. I tell you this because I want you to understand that I'm a very experienced deliverer of these qualifications. But I've also worked with Pearson for over 20 years as an international standards verifier, as an examiner and a trainer, amongst other things. So I've got a lot of experience of working with centres in the international arena. Hopefully I can use the experience that I've had over those years to help you understand the key issues around assessment, verification, and so on that we're going to be talking about today. So hopefully by the time we get to the end of this session, everything that I've covered will meet all your expectations and perhaps some of the questions that you might have regarding this qualification. So these are the main objectives of this event. We want you to understand the main features of the International Level 2 qualification, particularly engineering, but the key aspects of the way the qualification is delivered and presented is similar across all BTEC Level 2 qualifications. We want you to be able to understand how you can successfully plan your BTEC program, how you can deliver engaging assessment. And assessment is the key to how qualifications are delivered and how students achieve. To understand how quality assurance works, the internal verification process and the external verification process. And hopefully, obviously this is a recording, so I won't be able to respond to specific questions, but hopefully any questions that you might have will be covered during the presentation and the materials that we use. There will be a pack of materials which I understand will be downloadable for you. And I'll be going through those as we go through the presentation. So this will be an activity we would normally have if we were face-to-face, where I'm saying introduce yourself in the chat and whether you've taught BTEC before. Obviously, as this is a recording, that's not going to happen, but it'll be interesting. I'm going to assume that the majority of people are new to BTECs. And obviously, if some of you are more experienced, then I don't want you to, expression we have in the UK is, I don't want to teach you to suck eggs. So some of the things might be straightforward, but there'll be details in here that are useful for you, whether you've never taught BTECs before or whether you're very experienced with delivering BTECs. It is worth jotting down a few points that you might have, any questions you might have, because you can then sort of tick those off as we go through the recording, or you can always go back and listen again to any parts of this if you feel that you're not quite sure about a particular element. So let's start at the basics level, if we like, in terms of the fundamentals of delivering a BTEC qualification. And to understand this, you really need to understand that a BTEC is not the same as a more traditional academic curriculum. When we think of traditional academic curriculums, certainly in the UK, and I know in a lot of the international centres that I work with, we think about students that will be learning across the course of a semester or a year and leading up to a final examination. So all the study and practice and so on goes up to leading to a final examination where students will sit in an examination hall and respond to questions in a test paper. This is a very traditional mode. It's used in GCSEs and A levels in the UK typically. But BTEC is very different. A BTEC qualification is built up from a series of units. So it's a modular qualification, and we'll get into that a little bit later. There is some choice for you as a centre what units you deliver. So some units are mandatory and have to form part of a qualification, and some are optional, so you can choose which units you want to deliver. BTECs come in different sizes, um, and each unit from each size is assessed separately. So if you had a qualification that had, say, 4 units on it, those 4 units are assessed separately, and the grades from those units are combined to create a qualification grade. The key to this, of course, is not necessarily mentioned in this slide, but we're going to look at it a little bit later, is that all the assessment is internal. You carry out assessment as students are progressing along their qualification. We don't wait till the end and then give them an examination. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Just to give you an idea of the levels here, we've put level 2 and level 3 on this slide, but level 2 is what we're talking about today. And so we've highlighted that in red. This would typically be for learners aged 14 to 16 in the UK. And there are 4 different sizes of the qualification. There's the award size, which is equivalent to 1 international GCSE, has a guided learning hours of 120 hours. Now, the certificate size is double that, 240 hours. The extended certificate, 3 times the award size, and the diploma, 4 times the award size. So 4 different sizes of qualification. And each of those can be delivered sort of progressively, if you like. So in some cases, a student might start off on the certificate side and then may actually bump up to the diploma. But generally speaking, you have a qualification BTEC size that you're planning to deliver. The guided learning hours is the recommended number of hours of teacher-led delivery, if you like, or directed study time. So although the guided learning hours is for the qualification, each unit also has a guided learning hours sort of advisory as well, which gives you an idea of how big the unit is. And we'll talk about that when we get to look at some of the units. So hopefully you'll see what we mean by that. So those are just the different sizes of qualification. But here's a sort of an overview of how the internal assessment process works, and it comes back to what we were talking about just a moment ago. So every BTEC has a qualification specification. The specification outlines what the learner should know, what they should be able to do, and how they'll be assessed. There's a link on the slide there, but it's also on the web page, which we'll have time to have a look at a bit later on. And what we'll do is we'll look at different elements from the specification as we go to today's presentation. So we'll be using that as our what you might call go-to document. It's the most important document you'll have when you're delivering a BTEC. So you always start with the specification. Now, in terms of assessment, learners are assessed using either Pearson set assignments or authorized assignment briefs. Now, we'll get into the internal verification process a little bit later, but essentially, if you're a new centre, then you have to use the Pearson set assignments for those units they apply to, and you have to use the authorized assignment briefs for the other units. Now, if you're briefs and start developing your own assignments, but certainly in the first instance, you do need to use the authorized assignment briefs if you're a new centre. And we'll look at both those kinds of assignments. We'll talk about how they're put together, how they're structured, and how they are used to measure learners' achievements, which is essentially what we're talking about in the next sort of column here. We're saying learners respond to an assignment and their work is internally assessed. So what we mean by that is if an assignment asks for a student to give you written responses, those written responses will be submitted to you from the learner. You will assess those or mark those, and you'll give a grade against those responses. If the assignment asks for a student presentation, the learner would give that presentation, and then you would measure that against the requirements to see what grade they deserve from that presentation. So when we say respond to an assignment, we talk about them presenting evidence. It's not always a written piece of work. It can be a practical or a presentation or lots of different ways. But how do we assess that? What do we use to make that assessment decision? Well, that's where we use something called assessment criteria. And we also use the essential information for assessment decisions. And both the assessment criteria and the essential information for assessment decisions are clearly stated within each unit specification, and the unit specifications are all combined into the overarching specification, which I mentioned at the start of this slide. So you can use that specification to look at the measures that are required to assess your learners. And that's the most important thing, because external auditors like myself, I came to your centre, I would have the specification as my sort of starting point, and I will be looking at whether your learners are meeting the requirements of that specification. When the work has been assessed, a sample is then internally verified by the centre to check that standards are being met. So what we mean by that is you as a teacher will make those assessments, and then a colleague, somebody in your team, will just review a sample of those assessments to just make sure that you're not missing anything and you're giving the correct grades. It's a sense check. It's a way that we use our colleagues to help us make sure we're making the right decisions. And then, as I sort of touched on a moment ago, Pearson engages with a centre once or twice a year. So if you're a new centre, you'll get 2 visits from or either remote or face-to-face visits from an international standards verifier. So as I said, that will be somebody like myself. I would contact you. We'd get engaged in a dialogue in terms of planning when to have the assessment, the verification activity. And I would then look at your assessments and look at your verification and your processes and talk to staff and so on, and give you some feedback on where you are with applying standards. And again, we'll talk a bit more about that as we get through the presentation. If there are no compliance issues, if you are assessing at the right standard, then you'll be in a position where you can claim your certificates for your learners. So the International Standards Verifier process is the process that allows you to certificate your students. So it's that external check you have to make sure that you're meeting standards. And this sort of process applies, broadly speaking, the same way whether you're delivering level 2, level 3, level 4, or level 5. So it's a common process across BTEC qualifications. There are minor differences in terms of when you get to the higher levels, but broadly speaking, it's this same sort of process. So if we were to look at a typical program that you might deliver over 2 years, that might consist of 7 units in this case. And it might be that you deliver Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 5 in the first year, and Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 20, and Unit 8 in the second year. And you can see that those bars there are longer and shorter, and that'll be because the guided learning hours are different for those units. So typically, Unit 3 and Unit 8 might be 60 guided learning hours. Unit 4, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 5, and Unit 20 might be 30 guided learning hours. So they're shorter. But you'll be free to design your program how you like, what order you do the units in, and so on. But during the first year, you'll have a contact with a standards verifier, somebody like myself, who will look at your delivery. So, for example, in year 1, I would look at Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 5. And if I was happy with standards there, then I would feedback to you that those standards are being met, and you'd be able to bank those the grades for those, and then move on to year 2. And if at the end of year 2 I was happy with the delivery of the year 2 units, then you would combine the grades for those with the grades for the year 1 units. That would build up to an overall qualification grade, and you'll be able to then award that certificate to the student with that final grade listed on there. So it's an ongoing process with the standards verifier, and particularly if you're new to delivery, if it's a brand new program, then at the end of year 1, you wouldn't be in a position to certificate, but you'd still get the feedback and help from the standards verifier who would say you're not yet fully sampled, you're partway through the process, but things are going well, or perhaps these are the actions you need to take on board. This will be the typical sort of process for a 240 guide learning hour qualification. Okay, let's have a bit of a closer look at that planning process, which we touched on just a moment ago. When you're planning to deliver a BTEC qualification, you need to have a think about, certainly in the first instances, these 4 points we've listed on the screen. So you need to think about what size of qualification you're planning on delivering. Will you deliver a specific pathway? We'll talk about that in a moment. How many units do you need to deliver? Which of those units are mandatory? And which units are assessed using the Pearson set assignment, which you remember I just talked about a moment ago. So it's perhaps useful at this point to have a look at the structure of the qualification. So I'll just share the slide for that with you. And sorry, that's the wrong one, bear with me. Here we are. Apologies about that. So here's the structure of the qualification at a glance. Now this is in the specification. You can see in the bottom right hand corner, it's page 5 of the specification. And this gives you an idea of the listing of the units, unit size, and whether units are mandatory or optional. So if we just think back to those 4 bullet points we had, what size of qualification are you planning on delivering, and will you deliver a specific pathway? So it might be that you're thinking of delivering the diploma, for example, which I've highlighted there. But it may also be the case that you have a specialism in your centre of vehicle technology, in which case you'd be looking at the column that's highlighted VT there. Now, if that was the case, you can see that units 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are mandatory units. You have to deliver those as part of the qualification. And out of those 480 guided learning hours, which you can see highlighted there, you've got 30, 60, 90, 120, 150 are mandatory. But let's just scroll through and see if there are any more. So I'm now onto the second page, still all optional for vehicle technology. In fact, that's the whole list of units. So it's only those 5 units that are mandatory for vehicle technology. If you're delivering mechatronic, the MA highlighted one there, it's the same 5 mandatory units, but you'll also notice that unit 24 is a mandatory unit and unit 28 is a mandatory unit. And those are both 60 guide learning hour units. So they're double the size of the first 5. They're bigger units, if you like. So you do need to have a look at this grid just to see which units you do need to deliver, which are mandatory. Then, of course, you need to have a look at what other units you're going to deliver, because if you remember, 150 hours of mandatory unit still leaves you with 330 guided learning hours to fill with other units. So you can then select any of these other units to fit your profile. It's likely, if you were delivering the motor vehicle one, that the ones towards the bottom will be delivered because they're the specific motor vehicle units. But you've got a choice here. You can look at all these units and decide what's appropriate based on your learners, based on the local industry, based on the teaching profile and what skills you have. So you've got a fair bit of choice here. And obviously it's very much demand led, this, depending on what your learners are requiring. And of course, the final point we made, so we talked about the number of units, we talked about which are mandatory, but how many units are assessed using a Pearson set assignment? And that's the ones that are grayed out here. So you can see that the legend at the top has a Pearson set assignment as a gray grayed out box there. So Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, and Unit 5 will have Pearson set assignments, and all the rest will use authorised assignment briefs. So that's the case, whatever qualification. You can see the mandatory units change depending on the unit size. So if you were doing the award, only units 1 and 2 are mandatory, and so on. So this is your sort of the first document you look at in terms of designing your program to decide which units you're going to deliver, and that then spins out which ones are going to be Pearson set assignment units and which ones are going to be using authorized assignment briefs. And again, this language may be a bit new to you, but don't worry, I'll go through this in quite a bit of detail as we move through the rest of the slides. Oops, let's go back to just share with you the presentation. Just find that again. Here we are. Okay, so back to the presentation. So those that document in the specification is your starting point. That's going to give you guidance on what program you're going to deliver and what units you're going to deliver. Let's then kind of deep dive a bit now and have a look at those BTEC units, because we've talked quite a lot about what they are, but we haven't really sort of introduced them properly. So to do this, it's worthwhile having a look at the way a BTEC unit is structured. So as we've said, the qualification specification is your go-to document. That's what you look at when you're working out what you're going to plan, what you're going to teach, how you're going to assess and mark, and how you're going to internally verify. Now, each unit specification is broken down into these bullet-pointed sections. So you've obviously got the unit title, the level, which will be level 2 in this case, the type of unit. So if it's an internal unit, that's where you use the authorized assignment briefs. If it says Pearson set assignment, then that's obviously going to be one that you're using the Pearson set assignments for. If you remember, that was units 2, 3, 4, and 5. The guided learning hours will be there. There'll be an overview of the unit in brief, explaining what the unit's about. That'll be followed by an introduction to the unit. The learning aims will be there with all the content that's linked to that, and then a summary of the unit. That then spills out into the more detailed elements, which I just touched upon. So you'll have the content, that's what you're going to teach. You'll have the assessment criteria, how you assess the unit. You have the essential information for assignments, which is guidance on what's required in assignments. And then there's further resource information, which we'll look at in a moment. And you can see the one in bold there, essential information for assessment decisions, or EIAD. That one's really critical. So the ones in bold, the content, assessment criteria, and essential information for assessment decisions are the critical one when we're looking at standards. If we have a quick look at a couple of those units, I think that'll probably help. So I'm going to screen share again now, and we're going to have a look at, we'll have a look at Unit 3 to begin with. So that was the one we were just looking at a moment ago. Here's Unit 3. So this one is investigating an engineering product. And what we can see immediately there is that this is a Pearson set assignment. So that's useful. We know that we're going to be using one of the Pearson set assignments to deliver this unit. There's a brief introduction to the unit, more detail there. This unit has a Pearson set assignment. Learners must complete a Pearson set assignment brief. So that's just reminding us. There are 2 learning aims. These are the learning aims. So there's a bit of linking there as to what the students are going to be learning. So they'll learn about metals and alloys, polymers, composites, and properties and materials. So obviously that part of the unit is about materials. The second part is machining, shaping and manipulation, casting and molding, joining, and scales of production. So that's obviously about specific manufacturing methodologies. And then you've got the content, which is what you're going to be teaching. So these are the sort of, when you're looking at ferrous metals, you make sure you cover steels, cast irons, wrought irons, when you look at non-ferrous metals, make sure that you're teaching the learners about aluminium, copper, zinc, tin, magnesium, titanium, lead, nickel, and chromium. You don't have to do any other kinds of non-ferrous metals. So this is guidance on what you need to teach them if they're going to be able to access assessment appropriately. So this is helping you with your teaching. And there are schemes of work and assessment guides on the website linked to this as well, by the way. Then you've got the assessment criteria. So here's the key part of it. So to achieve A.P1 and P2, so those are the two pass criteria, students need to be able to complete those two elements. If they are then able to go beyond that and achieve what's required at merit level, then they can get to a merit. If they get to a distinction level, they can get a distinction. I'll break down in a lot more detail how we use these criteria a little bit later, but this grid's absolutely essential because it determines the grade that the student can achieve for the unit. If all four of those pass criteria are evidenced, the student will achieve a pass. If all four of those pass criteria and both of the merit criteria are evidenced, they'll achieve a merit. And if they evidence all of the pass, all of the merit, and both of the distinction, then they'll achieve a distinction. So they move across, and you can see that typically, for example, for a pass, they need to identify and describe materials. For a merit, they need to explain materials, how they're selected. And then for distinction, they need to evaluate those materials. So it's like the Bloom's taxonomy. It moves higher in level as they go through. But to be able to evaluate, you're going to need to identify and describe. So they should, we call this scaffolding, they should move from one to the other. So that's a typical breakdown of a unit, and it's telling you there's going to be a teacher's Pearson set assignment. And this section is the essential information for assessment decisions. This links to the assessment criteria. It does tell you what's required for a distinction standard, what's required for a merit standard, and what's required for a pass standard. So whilst we've got the criteria that are quite brief, I suppose, there's then more emphasis or greater detail in the essential information for assessment decisions. We can look at a different unit. If we look at Unit 12, for example, this one is business improvement techniques. Now this one is an internal unit. Now when it says an internal unit, we know that we're going to present the students with assignments that either you've written as a centre or you're using the authorised assignment briefs. Now, in my experience, obviously I've explained that if you're a new centre, you have to use the authorised assignment briefs. But in my experience, even those centres who have been running this qualification for 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years, generally speaking, will use the authorised assignment briefs or may just tweak them a little bit. There's some details they want to just change a little bit. And that makes sense. If those assignments are written and authorised, you know, it's why would you not use them? You know, they're a great resource. Other than that, the unit is structured in exactly the same way. You can see it's got an introduction. There's 2 learning aims. The learning aims are summarised here. The content to help you teach is here. This is what we expect you to teach. The EGs are just examples, by the way. So if you're talking about reducing cost, you don't have to cover all of the EGs. It's just so long as you make sure you do cover ways of reducing waste by reducing cost, for example, and improving quality. So if you see a list of EGs and it's a really long list, you don't have to include all of them. They're just examples, if you like. Other than that, we expect you to teach all the content. Here's the criteria again. So it's very similar. There's essential information for assignments. That's just explaining that this is slightly different to the Pearson set assignment. Here you can have 2 summative assignments because you've got 2 learning aims. So the authorised assignment briefs is probably going to be 2 for this unit. You can't write lots and lots of assignments. For example, there's 4 pass criteria, 2 merit and 2 distinction. You can't write 8 assignments, 1 for each criteria. It doesn't work that way. The minimum you have to achieve is one learning aim. So in this case, you could have two assignments, one for learning aim A and one for learning aim B, or you could have one big assignment that covers both, which is what a Pearson set assignment would look like. Generally speaking, centres will write an assignment for each of the learning aims. So if it was a bigger unit and there were three learning aims, they might write three assignments, but at the minimum, you have to cover one learning aim. Following on from that, we've got exactly the same sort of information. We've got resources that are available, and then we've got this a section that covers the essential information for assessment decisions, which really builds on what's in the criteria and tells you what we would expect from a student at distinction standard, merit standard, and pass standard for learning aim A, and the same for learning aim B. So that's what the units look like. There's some links to other units, ideas for employer engagement and so on, and transferable skills. But generally speaking, that's the structure. And this all comes from the specification. You can see this is page 149, 150. So this is deep into the specification, this part, because it's one of the later units. Okay, so back to the slide. We were talking about the structure, and hopefully you've seen from those two examples what the unit looks like. Perhaps just focusing in on that a little bit more, and just emphasising what I've just said. As an assessor, and we use the word assessor when we really, generally speaking, we mean teacher, because the teachers, generally speaking, if you're a teacher, you're the one who's going to be assessing the students or the learners. Needn't necessarily be the case, but generally speaking, that is what happens, and that's what we see when we visit centres around the world in the UK. So you've been teaching the unit, and then when you're carrying out assessment, you must judge the learner evidence, whatever they've submitted, using the assessment criteria and the essential information for assessment decisions. So that's what we focused on a moment ago, and we will do as we go along. But of course, you do need to be aware of whether it's suitable in terms of the content. So of course, that's when it comes back to, for example, when we were looking at ferrous metals, are the learners considering the ferrous metals that we've taught them and that are in the unit? Or if we're talking about non-ferrous metals, are they focusing in on what we expect you to have taught them rather than very unusual ones? So the green section here is really important, but you just need to be aware of the content. So any assignment brief that you write or that you deliver must provide a full opportunity for all your learners to provide the full range of evidence at a level 2 standard. So you've got to make sure that the assessment criteria allowing students to meet, for example, all the pass and the merit and the distinction. You're not just focusing on the pass and then you're disadvantaging them. As I say, the authorised assignment briefs cover all of that, so they're a really good starting point. Just focusing in on this expression, holistic assessment. We touched on it a moment ago. It's essential that a learning aim is assessed as a whole. So if you're writing an assignment, for example, this one is Unit 8, Learning Aim A, you mustn't split this down into five different tasks. So it can't be question 1, P1, question 2, P2, question P3, because that encourages learners to just, in some cases, just perhaps do the first 3 questions and then not worry about the rest of it. So we write the assignment as an overarching task, which covers all of the criteria. We'll look at example in a moment, and then you'll see what we mean by that. But the Pearson set assignments and the authorised assignment briefs are written that way. But also that we've designed these so that a student can't achieve, for example, the D1 grade, the distinction grade, unless they've completed P1, P2, P3, and M1, just the way it's developed. So if the student is justifying the selection of the most appropriate tools and work holding devices, they need to explain which tools and work holding devices they've used, and they need to be selecting them so that they can then justify them. So it scaffolds, if you like. So this process of holistic assessment. We focus in on the requirements of the distinction, but we make sure that in doing that, students cover all the pass and the merit. And holistic assessment is something that we also focus on across the whole range of our BTEC qualifications, from level 2 all the way up to level 5 and beyond. So it's a principle that BTEC holds very close. Okay, so we've talked about Pearson set assignments, we've talked about authorized assignment briefs. Let's have a look at Pearson set assignments then. So a Pearson set assignment is set by Pearson. So that's I mean the key is the Pearson set assignment. We write them as an awarding body, so people like myself and other colleagues will write these assignments. There'll be one overarching assignment to cover the whole unit, so you've got to think about that when you're planning your delivery and assessment. It'll be broken down into different activities because otherwise it could be pretty overwhelming for learners. And then each Pearson set assignment has its own guidance because these can be quite substantial pieces of work. So there'll be timings associated with them and levels of control and so on. And these are all clearly stated in the documentation. Now, learners must complete a live Pearson set assignment for units 2, 3, 4, and 5, depending on the size of the qualification, of course. You do not write assignment briefs for these units, and you can't adapt Pearson set assignments. They are absolutely the same for every centre. You can complete them at any period during the programme, but as we touched upon, it probably makes sense to have them towards the end of a semester or a unit because they're pretty substantial. There are two, I mean, this is slightly dated. There are 2 live Pearson set assignments each year. So for example, in 2022, there were 2. In 2023, there were 2 and they were different. In 2024, there were 2 and they were different. Now, what's useful about this is you can go to the website and you can access the previous Pearson set assignments. You can see we've got sample PSAs that are available for those units, and there's a link to them there. If we have time later, I'll show you them on the website. So you can go back to previous Pearson set assignments for your unit, if you're teaching Unit 2, for example, and you can use those as practice activities with your learners. Now, the reason we have 2 is because if the learner completes the first one and doesn't reach the pass standard, then they've got the second one as a reset opportunity. So there's 2 just so that you've got a first attempt one and a reset one. And we'll talk about the kind of resets and resubmissions a bit later. You don't have to internally verify the Pearson set assignment, so you don't have to say to a colleague, can you just make sure this assignment is fit for purpose? Because they're set and they can't be adapted. You do, however, have to check your assessment decisions because once students have sat these assessments, you as a teacher are going to then mark them and assess them and grade them. And again, you do need a colleague just to look over them and make sure that you're meeting the right standard. We'll have a look at the IV documentation, how that works a bit later. It'll always be the case that when an international standards verifier either visits you or has a remote visit with you, they'll always sample Pearson set assignments. They'll look at your marking of maybe one of the pass, one of the merit, and one of the distinction learners, and just check that you're making the decisions appropriately. So this slide is guiding you to think about your delivery. You'll need to think about when you're going to hand out your Pearson set assignment. As we said, it's probably going to be towards the end of the unit because of it's very summative and there's a lot of content there. You're going to have to plan how you deliver that assessment. We'll look at a live one shortly and then we'll think about that. Clearly, you'll need to make sure that learners are ready for that assessment. So they've had a go at maybe some practice PSAs so they know how it's structured and what the process is. And then when you're assessing, you're going to make sure you look at the assessment guidance and then you internally assess and award an IV as with other units. And if there are resets required, then you can offer those. And again, I'll explain how the resit and resubmission process works a little bit later. There may well be control issues here, which will be in the assessment guidance. For example, we might not allow access to the internet if the students are working on a kind of a project type of thing, for example. So the main differences between an internal assignment and a Pearson set assignment. Well, for the Pearson set assignment, learners will need to retain knowledge for the whole unit. You can't do one learning aim, do an assessment, do the second learning aim, do a second assessment. So you can't break down the assessment. It's one complete assessment for the whole unit. Learners often have longer periods of time to complete the assessment. So a Pearson set assignment could be 8, 10, 12 hours, whereas an internal authorized assignment brief may only be 4 or 6 hours. And the teacher has no input throughout the assessment. So what we mean by that is you can't help them, you can't guide them. If a student asks you a question about the administration of the assignment, if they like, and what they can bring in with them, then you obviously can answer those questions, but you can't give them any guidance or any help with completing the assignment. And perhaps we can have a look at this activity, and we'll look at an example of a sample Pearson set assignment just to give us an idea about how they're structured and what we have to do. So we'll look at the Unit 3 specification. We did look at that earlier, but we'll look at it again. And we'll look at one of the sample Pearson set assignments, and then we'll kind of answer these questions. I mean, I'll answer them for you, obviously, but we'll go through them so that we're picking up on all the key points. So let's bring up the relevant document. So what I've got here is the Unit 3 specification, and we can see it has a Pearson set assignment. If I go to this one, this is the Pearson set assignment. Investigating engineering product. There's the details. It's for use with all those levels of qualification. And in this case, it's 4 hours. So we anticipate that you'll give learners 4 hours to complete this. There's lots of administrative information here. So it's going to be assessed internally. Should be undertaken in conditions that assess the authenticity. This may require supervision. So what we'd probably expect here is that you'd have learners in a session all together working on the assignment, and you will be supervising to make sure they're not helping each other. Now, it's a 4-hour assessment, and you could do that in one continuous 4-hour period. However, it might not work for you in your setting. So you might decide to have a 2-hour session on a Tuesday, for example, and a 2-hour session on a Wednesday. Now, how would you manage that? Well, the set assignment should not be shared with the learners. So obviously they'll come into the first assessment period and you'll share the documentation with them. It then says that teachers and tutors are responsible for security of the assignment and materials. So what happens typically is a lot of centres would then, at the end of the first 2 hours, they collect in all the evidence from the students and pop them in a folder somewhere securely. Students would then obviously disappear to the next session or home or whatever. And then the following day when they come in for the next 2-hour session, when they come into the classroom or the practical activity, whatever it is, then they would get their materials back, they get the assignment back and whatever work they'd already done, and they would be able to carry on with it. So that will be a typical approach you would use to making sure that it's secure. Learners can submit handwritten or word processed evidence. They've got to make sure it's their own work. So, they'd write their names on there and so on, or fill in the authenticity document. And if using a computer, they must save their work regularly. That's just guidance, obviously. And here we are, learners must complete an authentication sheet. So that authentication sheet will be part of the package that you'll get with the Pearson set assignment. Learners have got some instruction. The set assignment has 2 activities and they must complete both the activities. So in this case, they're looking at a vice that has two components, or the two components they've got to look at, which will be two different materials, obviously. So they've got to think about the materials, they've got to describe those materials, do some evaluation. So you can see this is kind of broken down, linked to the criteria, as it were. For each of the components, they've got to look at those materials. They've got to look at the process they would use to manufacture them. So there's guidance on what activities they should do there. And that's the assignment. So that's what a Pearson set assignment looks like. Typical example. There are more on the website. The only thing that's missing is the assessment date, because obviously that's down to you when you complete that, and then you could fill that in and you could highlight which of these are being achieved, which qualification it applies to. But of course, you still need to go back to the specification, particularly when you're assessing this, because when you look at the student evidence, you'll be looking at these criteria. We talked about these a little bit earlier. And when you look at the evidence, you have to make a decision where students are really evaluating, or whether they're just explaining, or whether they're simply identifying and describing. So we focus a lot on these, what we call active verbs. Identify could be just a labeled diagram or a list, couldn't it? Whereas explain, you need to say what the material is and why it's being used, rather than just identifying it. And when you evaluate, it might be that you compare that material with another material, what's good about material A against material B, and so on. So it's moving through the levels of high level thinking, if you like. So coming back to the questions we were looking at, you can see that it's quite a big assignment. It's in terms of level 2 standards, it certainly is. There's quite a few activities required here, and they cover the whole unit. So the first question was, should the PSA be handed out to learners at an early stage or a later stage in the program? Most likely it'd be at a later stage because it encompasses the whole unit. What is the best approach to teaching the content in the unit specification? Well, you see it's focused on the criteria. So whenever you're looking at content for this unit, if we just look at the first one, for example, just to give you an example, if you're looking at metals and alloys, you'd probably be thinking, can the learner identify what these materials are by looking at them or looking at an application? Can they apply them to an application? So in your teaching, you need to be thinking about, where would you use aluminium, where would you use steel, where would you use tin, and so on. And then can they evaluate? Can they explain what steel is? Can they explain what aluminium is? Can they evaluate which is the better material for specific products? And again, use products that the learners are familiar with. So you might say, well, what's the best material for a bicycle? Would you use steel, aluminium, or copper? And the learners might say, well, you clearly wouldn't use copper, it's not strong enough. Aluminium is lightweight, but steel is really robust, so they're then thinking about, well, which would be the best one to use, and could we make an alloy out of aluminium to make it a bit stronger, and all that sort of thought process that you would expect from learners. The third question was, how can you best prepare learners for assessment? So then we're thinking about, well, perhaps how can we use I'll bring the questions back up actually. Could you use one of the practice Pearson set assignments to prepare them for the process so that they know what it's going to look like? You could do a supervised session with them and say, let's work on this practice assessment, and then we'll have a look at it. And then finally, how will you conduct the assessment? Again, I touched on that. It's, how are you going to supervise the learners? Are you going to do it in one session or in more than one session? How are you going to keep the materials secure until that point where you deliver the assessment? All those things you've got to think about with these Pearson set assignments. So they're sort of like an external assessment, but they're not an examination, obviously. Now, how does that contrast with the other units? So we've got those units 2, 3, 4, 5 that have Pearson set assignments, and they're delivered in the way I've just explained. The internal units we use authorized assignment briefs. So we've talked about assignment briefs without explaining them. What is an assignment brief? Well, principally, it's an assessment tool. It's reference to criteria, the assessment criteria, and when you make those assessment decisions, they are what we call binary decisions. So it's either a pass or a merit. There can't be something in between. It's a pass, a merit, or a distinction. Those are the grades we deliver. They're not percentages. They're not marks out of 10. They're specific grades. And so the activity must allow you to make those decisions, and clearly must allow learners to generate appropriate assessment evidence. So you need to tell the learners what evidence you expect from them, and it must be obviously accessible to them. An assignment brief is a summative assessment tool. In other words, we're making assessment decisions based on something that we've previously delivered. When we talk about formative assessment, that's the sort of thing you do in your teaching. So you maybe do a quiz in your teaching, or you may ask questions during your teaching. That's formative assessment to bring out knowledge from the learners. Summative assessment is where we give them an assessment activity that generates an assessment decision or a grade. So, authorized assignment briefs, they are generated by Pearson experts. So engineering colleagues will have written these assessments. They're on the web page under the internal assessments category. You can make additions or changes to them, so you can make them relevant to your learners. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. So you can tweak them. That's the expression we use. We use them for all units except for 2, 3, 4, and 5 because they're not Pearson set assignments. And if you're a new centre, you must use the AABs for at least the first academic year. But as I say, in my experience, centres in the UK and internationally tend to use them going forward year on year, maybe just changing the scenario or tweaking something here and there. And we'll look at an example in a minute, just so you can see what I mean by that. Now, you've got to be careful here because often an authorized assignment brief will require you to just add something. So it might be that you need to choose a product or provide an engineering drawing. And the reason that we require you to do that is because we can't tell as a external body what resources you have that allow your learners to carry out an activity. So we can't choose a product that the learners won't have any familiarity with, won't be able to access. You can choose a product that you can give them to look at. You know, they can put it in their hands. They can see what it's made of. They can see how it's made. So the AABs won't have that. It'll just say a product or a drawing, or it might say you will be provided with, and then that's your requirement. If you focus on an inappropriate engineering product, whether it's too simple or unnecessarily complex, then that gives you problems with assessment decisions. And we can look at that actually. We'll do a little activity. So this one is for Unit 1. And we're going to look at Learning Aim B and decide which of these two products is the most appropriate. So let's share the screen for Unit 1 specification. Now I've got an abridged version just so we don't look at the whole thing. So if I share this with you on the screen, here we are. This is the abridged version of Unit 1. So we're looking at Unit Aim B. So Unit Aim B is asking learners to look at risks in an activity, to select PPE, to carry out an engineering work activity safely. So that's a bit vague. Let's have a look at the essential information for assessment decisions to see if that helps us. So here's Learning Aim B coming up. Now this is where the essential information for assessment decisions really helps, which is why I emphasized it earlier. So Learning Aim must include full details of the work activity to be included. So you're going to have to include that. And that could be drilling and reaming a hole through a plate. So that would be two activities, the drilling and the reaming, I guess. It could be milling a smooth face on a square bar. It could be turning a smooth face on a round bar. or it could be welding a joint to attach two plates. Now look, it says examples for suitable engineering work activities include, but are not limited to. So if none of those are appropriate, you could use something similar, provided you're covering the requirements of the content and the criteria and so on. So in the example we looked at, it wasn't drilling or reaming, it wasn't milling, it wasn't turning, but it did look like it was welding. And this one says welding a joint to attach two plates. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, and here's two examples. Now the first example, if I just bring up the pen here, this example that I'm highlighting here is simply welding two plates together. And that meets one of the requirements we looked at. So this one would be fine. Now this one, clearly there's welding going on here. We can see the joints are welded. But there's also quite a lot of forming and bending required, which are additional engineering processes. There's also holes in this which require drilling. And I think there's even a slot towards the top, which would require a more complex operation, possibly milling or punching. Either way, this one, it's just too complicated. There's too many things going on for what's required from the specification. So it's easy to see how you could pick something that's too complex. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is just be careful if you've got an assignment brief where you have to add something to it. Just look at the assessment criteria and the essential information for assessment decisions before you decide what product you're going to use or what drawing or image you're going to use. Okay. So remember, a Pearson set assignment, you can't change anything. However, for an authorized assignment brief, there are some changes you can make. So we'll look at an example in a minute, but you can change, for example, the scenario. So the scenario might say you work for an engineering company, and it might be that local to you there's that's I don't know, there might be a BMW plant, for example. So you might decide, oh well, we'll say you work for BMW. You can change minor aspects of the task. So if the task asks learners to take a photograph, but you haven't got access to um, they haven't got access to cameras or whatever, you could say, when you've completed this activity, ask the teacher to take a photograph. So, it's more about the administration of the activity rather than actually changing what it says. You can change the form of evidence. If, for example, we've said we want the learners to give a presentation, but you haven't got access to the appropriate software or whatever, you might say, well, no, you can just give me a written report instead. And it might be that the resources, you might have a specific resource that can help the learners that isn't listed on the brief, and you can add that, or sources of information. You might have a website you want to go to, or you might have a document you want to look at. Because these are all things that help the learner without changing the way the evidence meets the requirements. You can't change the assessment criteria. Clearly that's from the specification. Can't change the wording from the learning aims or the command verbs because that's all from the specification. And you mustn't add your own criteria because, then you wouldn't be assessing to the right standard. So those are things you can't do. So we'll just break that down a little bit because we did touch on it a moment ago. Each assignment has a scenario. That scenario should be relevant to the learners. It should be work related because these are vocational qualifications. Should be set at an appropriate level. A level 2 learner, it probably wouldn't be right to give them a role as a managing director of a multinational, for example. It should motivate and engage the learner, so it should be something linked to what they're going to be doing in the workplace, which generally speaking means that the learner will have a job role, so they'd be a technician or an apprentice or an intern or something similar. There'll be an audience, so it might be that they're completing this activity to share with their colleagues or give a report to their team leader. And there should be a purpose, so there should be a problem to solve or a product to select or something that links to a real world activity. Let's have a look at what an authorized assignment brief looks like. And I'll go through this authorized assignment brief and highlight to you what changes that you can make to that so that it's appropriate for your learners. And this is really useful, I think, because this puts it into context. So we'll look at Unit 1, and we're going to look at the AAB for Learning Aim B, which is the one we just looked at a moment ago. So let's find the, oops, sorry, no, it's not a PDF, it's a Word document, so bear with me. Let's find that one. So, here we are. So this is what the authorized assignment briefs look like when you download them from the website. So this one has an assignment title, Safely Carry Out an Engineering Work Activity. Now we can see here that there's no assessor. So that's clearly something you do need to add. So I'll put my name in there because I'm going to be the assessor for this one. Right, there's no date issued. So I'm recording this on the 16th of October, so I'm going to put that date in here, 2024. The final deadline. Now, this is only a 2-hour assignment. It's quite a small one, isn't it? So this might be something that I would start off with the learners in the classroom, and it might well be that I'd expect them to complete it by the following week. So I might give them, maybe a week to complete this. So that'll be the 23rd. Obviously, if it was a bigger assignment, I might give them a bit longer. But you'll decide this depending on your delivery pattern, how often the students are in the centre, so on and so forth. Now here there's the whole qualification suite here. There's all the different qualifications that could be being delivered. But it may be that actually I'm doing this one as part of the level 2 award in engineering. So let's just delete all the other ones out of there. That's just going to confuse the learners. Now the unit covered is Unit 1, we can't change that, and it's Learning Aim B, we can't change that. Here's a scenario. You've just started work as an engineering trainee, that seems fine, at a large engineering company. Oh, well, that's a bit generic. And as it happens, I know a lot of the learners who are working in my centre are looking at the companies around, and they can see that there's an electronics company called Siemens that employs a lot of students. And it may be that I'm at a centre in Dubai, for example. So I might put that in there. So that localizes it, if you like. You're completing a placement in the production department. Your manager has provided you with an engineering drawing. Wow, we've got to be careful with that though. So you're going to need an engineering drawing at some point. And it's asked you to complete the required engineering work activity. It doesn't really say what that work activity is. So there's two things that are a little bit ambiguous here. An experienced colleague will watch what you are doing to make sure you work safely, so your manager is then confident to give you more complicated work to complete. So the experienced colleague is likely to be you as a teacher. Basically, they're saying you're going to watch the student carry out an activity. So that's a scenario. And here we are in task 1. Your tutor will provide you with an engineering drawing. So I'm going to highlight that bit because that's something you're going to have to provide. The engineering work activity to be completed is, now look, this is what you've got to be really careful. A lot of centres have fallen foul of this. Do you remember that list of 4 different things there? If I go back to the specification, it's those 4 listed here, isn't it? Now, you don't have to do all 4. The engineering work activity must take place in a workshop and learners should be provided with an engineering drawing. We know that. Examples of engineering work activities include, so you only have to use one of those. And this is where centres have made mistakes in the past. We've seen this time and time again. So I'm actually going to use the example we had on the slide. That will be helpful to me. I'm going to take that out. which is going to be a welding activity. So they need to provide a suitable risk assessment. That's fine. Select personal protective equipment. That's fine. They do a lot of things here where they look through the facilities that are available and make sure it's safe and they're using appropriate tools and so on. So that's all okay. Using a report, justify all the tasks, carry out engineering work to ensure that we know that's okay. So they've completed a risk assessment. So you probably give them a template for that. They'll produce a photograph of the completed activity. So when they've welded the two plates together, they'll take a photograph. They might annotate photographs, so they might show, the equipment they used. They'll make annotations showing how they prepared that material, how they prepared the equipment, and so on. The observation record is completed by you as a tutor. So you might say, just so that it's clear, these are the criteria it's addressing, and here are the resources. And you can see my name's in there because one of the books we used was co-written by me. So there's a list of textbooks, and then you can add further resources if necessary. So what we would need there is we need to make sure the facilities are available for the students to carry out that welding activity. And we'd need an engineering drawing showing the two plates and showing the size of weld and the type of weld that's required. So you can see that we've adapted a few things in here to make them relevant to the student, to the learner, and we're clear that we know what resources we need, and clearly they need an appropriate welding resource. If you haven't got a welding workshop, but you have got at least a pillar drill, then you perhaps carry out a drilling activity or a turning activity on a lathe. So you can choose those. But that's how we adapt the authorised assignment brief, folks. We just change it to make sure it's relevant to us. And you might do this in the first year, and then the second year of the program, you might decide that actually the welding activity didn't work as well as you wanted, and perhaps you would change that to a drilling activity for the next cohort. So you can change these. You don't have to stick with the same one every time. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So we said what needs to be amended or added to make sure it's ready for your learners. So you can see what we did. We just addressed some of the administrative bits and pieces there, but then we were very clear that I haven't got an engineering drawing to show you, but you would need to produce one for the learners, and you'd need to make sure you pick the right activity. So not every assignment brief requires that level of adaptation. We've chosen that one because there's quite a few things to adapt in it. To be honest with you, the majority of authorized assignment briefs, you're really just putting in the name, maybe tweaking the scenario, but generally speaking, everything else is there for you. But you do need to look through it and be careful, which is why you need to internally verify it. You need to make sure that the assessor has changed it appropriately and someone has just double checked to make sure that's the correct changes have been made and that it's going to be appropriate. With the person set assignments, you can't change them at all, so it's less of a risk, if you like. Okay, just a few ideas about how we can engage our learners in the whole process. If you're delivering one of our BTECs, engineering typically, but this is true of all of our BTECs, you really need to focus on the vocational aspect, and this is critical to our programs. They're all vocational programs. They're all linked to industrial requirements or training requirements or support environments, whichever BTEC you're doing. So engineering is clearly linked to the whole engineering field, manufacturing, vehicle technology, electronics, etc. And we want to be giving students practical activities. We want them to develop those transferable skills, working with others, working in teams, problem solving. So they need to be carrying out activities that they would do in the workplace. So when they're doing these practical activities like welding, for example, we want them to be making sure we follow the sort of safety procedures that they would see in the workplace. We need to make sure that they're working with other learners or other colleagues in the same way they would in the workplace and solve problems that they perhaps wouldn't have come across before. And creating um, assessments that have that sort of element to it really helps to develop those skills with your learners. Um, and you can emphasize those links with engineering by visiting engineering companies, by bringing colleagues or friends in who work in engineering to talk to students about what it's like working in an engineering environment. It might be that there's a specific example you can use from industry. It might be that if you're doing vehicle technology, for example, you might be able to um, have the students working on a real vehicle and looking at a real problem with that vehicle, programming something in it or replacing a component. It might be that there's a local organisation that has a problem with a specific part, and the students may be able to do some 3D printing of that part or manufacture a part. You can use work experience, and you place learners in the workplace with a local employer. So all of these things are opportunities, and we would encourage all of these things as part of the teaching because it just embeds this sort of vocational aspect to the whole program. Um, there are a range of delivery guides and schemes of work available, and we'll have a look at those actually when we get a chance. Um, Perhaps just later in the presentation as we get towards the end of it. Um, but do look at things like where units can be delivered together. So if you've got a health and safety unit, then you've got a practical unit like the one we were just looking at, where students are going to be in the workshops doing some welding activities. They're going to be hand in hand, aren't they? Um, Make sure that students are fully prepared so that there are no surprises when they get their assignments. And this idea of formative assessment is useful. So for the Pearson set assignments, give them a practice assignment, give them one of the sample ones. For the internal units, when you're teaching, give them some questions that link to that give them the opportunity to explain or evaluate or identify so that when they get the assignment proper, they're not going to be surprised. They're going to be using skills that they're familiar with. Okay, let's just have a look at the kind of quality assurance process because I've touched on this already. And I'll talk to you about what internal verification is. So first of all, why do we have it? Well, internal verification is your internal quality assurance process. It's to make sure that you're checking that the assignment briefs that you deliver are fit for purpose and that the assessment decisions that your teachers make are accurate. It's undertaken by specialists in your centre, so it'll be other members of the engineering team. It's a process that's supportive, so it's the assessor and the internal verifier working together. It's nothing to do with the learners, and it's there to particularly help your new teachers, but also help with compliance and continually improving. Although the forms have kind of opportunities to tick boxes, it's not a tick box exercise. It's a serious process, and we'll look at it in a moment to see what the forms look like. It's a key point here that if you're an assessor, you can't internally verify your own assignment briefs or your own assessment decisions. So if I'm teaching something, I'm going to be going to a colleague and saying, just check to make sure this assignment brief is fit for purpose for me, would you, before I give it to the students? Or I've just marked a batch of work. Can you just check to make sure my assessment decisions are correct before I feed back to the learners? You can't just think, oh, it's not a double check by you as an individual. We sometimes think of the internal verifier as a critical friend. So as a reminder, you as the assessor, or as I said before, you'll nearly always be the teacher or the tutor. You're responsible for teaching the unit, for making sure the assignment briefs you give those learners are fit for purpose, if it's an internal unit. You're responsible for marking the learner work and making accurate assessment decisions. and then completing the appropriate paperwork. And you're responsible for providing that feedback to the learners to help to explain to them why they've achieved the grade they have, perhaps why they haven't achieved a higher grade, and what the specific grade is for that particular assessment. As an internal verifier, you're probably a teacher of a different unit. So the teacher for Unit 1 will probably do internal verification for Unit 2, and the teacher for Unit 2 will probably do internal verification for Unit 1. We switch and swap with these things. You need to just double check that your colleague's assignment brief is fit for purpose and written correctly. You need to sample some of the assessment decisions of your colleague to make sure that the learner assessment evidence aligns with the grade they've been awarded and that they've been given appropriate feedback. And there's some paperwork that you need to fill out and store so that when the international standards verifier visits, they can look at the paperwork and make sure that you're completing it correctly and that the quality assurance process is in place. Now, oftentimes we have one person who's like the key member of staff teaching on a program. This will often be the person that the international standards verifier liaises with. We often call them a program manager or a course manager or a team leader. And in BTEC terms, and specifically in the UK, that person is also given the role of the lead internal verifier. You don't have to have that as a specific role, but what we're keen here is that the most responsible person on the program is managing that program. So they're making sure that all of the teaching team have got the right paperwork, of being standardized so that they know how to make assessment decisions. So standardization might be that you take an assignment brief, and you share it with all your colleagues and you go through it, make sure it's fit for purpose as a practice exercise. You might take some sample learner work from a previous year and look at it with the team and say, what assessment decisions should be made? How do we make that assessment decision? So you're training the team, if you like. The lead internal verifier should be very familiar with the standards, how the assessment criteria work, how the essential information for assessment decisions works. They should be able to write a fit for purpose assignment brief. They should be able to accurately assess and complete all the forms. So it's really the most experienced person in the team, and they're going to share that knowledge with the rest of the team. So if I was starting a new program, I'd be leading all my colleagues, explaining to them how all of the things work that build the program, essentially doing everything that's in this presentation. And what we often find is that colleagues who join this sort of training are often that person. They're often that lead internal verifier, that team leader. They'll take these slides and all the documentation and they'll share it with their colleagues and go through it with them to make sure that everyone's on board with how the process works. So, emphasizing it again, internal verification should be rigorous. It should conform to a centre-wide process. So what we mean by that is if you've got level 2 in hospitality, level 2 in construction, level 2 in health and social care, level 2 in engineering, all those programs should be using the same paperwork, using the same processes, and being systematically planned and managed in the same way. So often the quality assurance manager or the link with Pearson will manage that across the different programs. Clearly, that person must be able to access all the documentation, and it's important that we keep these records for 3 years after the data certification, just in case any appeals come up or any issues come up. You need to carry out IV in a timely manner, so make sure that you internally verify assignments before they go out to the students. Make sure that when you've made assessment decisions that you internally verify them quite quickly, because you need to get that feedback back to the learners, certainly before they undertake the next assessment for that unit. So typically, if a piece of work was submitted to me, I would assess it within 7 days. I would pass it on to a colleague to make sure they internally verify it within 7 days, so that the learners got their grades and their feedback within a fortnight. And that will be typically what you might do. We don't mandate that, but that's just typical. Often centres do it much quicker than that. The lead internal verifier or the most experienced teacher will keep a monitor of that to make sure that any issues have been resolved in terms of assignment briefs or assessment decisions, because it's all about continually improving and getting better as a centre. And it's a team approach. It's supportive. It's not, you don't the manager doesn't do all the internal verification and then use that as a tool to beat the teachers with. It's all about taking it seriously, being supportive and helpful, and making sure that standards are maintained or improved. So the first stage is the internal verification of an assignment brief. So these are the things to check. Has it got the right unit, program details, deadlines for assessment? Has it got appropriate scenario? Are the assessment criteria being identified? Has it been modified if need be? Think about the example we looked at a moment ago. That did need some modification. If it's just been, well, I've seen assignments like the one we looked at where they've just been left. And then you will say to the centre, where's the engineering drawing? Which of these 4 activities do you want the learners to do? And the teacher has not really picked that up. They've just taken the assignment off the shelf and given it to the learners without any guidance. So for AABs, it's generally a fairly straightforward process, but you still need to be careful to make sure that it's the correct version and the correct amendments have been made. The second stage of the IV process is the IV of assessment decisions. And here we take a sample. So typically, if you had a group of, say, 15 students, you might say to the assessor, I want to sample 1 pass, 1 merit, and 1 distinction. And I want to make sure that you've made the right assessment decision and that the feedback references the criteria and justifies why they've been awarded that grade or not awarded it. So it doesn't just say well done or you have done this and you haven't done that. For consistency, particularly when you've got a new member of staff, you might decide that you're actually going to look at 2 pass, 2 merit, and 2 distinction to make sure that those assessment decisions are being consistent. And if you're a little bit unsure as an IV, then you'll look at a few more. So it's very much a risk-based thing. You're also checking the assessment rules about submissions and resubmissions have been followed, and that there's no evidence of collusion or plagiarism in the learner assessment evidence. And I suppose at this point, we'll probably, I think we're going to do this. Yeah, we're going to do this actually now. I'll move on to the next slide. Let's have a look at a couple of documents, and we'll have a look at an IV sheet to see how we would fill it in. So we're going to look at Unit 12 here. I'm going to pick up these documents. We're going to look at some learner assessment evidence, and we're going to look at the specification. So there's an activity that we would normally do where I would ask you as an audience to complete this, but I'm going to do it on your behalf because this is a recording, obviously. So we're going to look at the bear with me. Right. So I'm going to look at Unit 12, which is business improvement techniques. And we're going to look at some learner evidence linked to that. So I'll flick between these 2 PDFs. So this is the learner work, and we'll move through to the assignment. Here we are, Learning AMA. So you can see I've highlighted that. So we're looking at Learning AMA. Now, let's just assume that the assignment brief was fit for purpose. Okay, that's important. So the assignment brief was fit for purpose. The learner has completed work against these criteria. So what the students got to do, or the learners got to do, is identify unnecessary waste by mapping a given business process. They've got to look at ways of reducing waste in that process. So they've got to suggest improvements, obviously. Um, Here, they've got to reduce waste by suggesting improvements based on comprehensive mapping. So that's a subtle difference. It looks very similar to the P2 requirement, but Merit 1 requires comprehensive mapping. And for distinction, they've got to evaluate what those benefits will do to that business. Now, there is a bit more in the essential information for assessment decisions. Um, for example, they've got to identify at least 4 non-value added steps on the business flowchart for a merit. That's a really useful example of where looking at the essential information for assessment decisions starts to scope a bit more what's required. Let's have a look at the learner work and pick out what's happened. So they've looked at the manufacture of a steel latch. They've looked at the process and they've said value-added processes are in green, non-value added are in red. Now, it's not critical that you understand the, all the ins and outs of this unit. You may not be familiar with business improvement techniques. What's important to note is that the student has carried out these activities appropriately here in terms of they're looking at things where there's no value added to the product, in red, and then they've highlighted in green where value is being added. So in this case, there's only 2 processes where values have been added. And they've put in little notes here. So this is really quite well laid out evidence, isn't it? So this is looking at an engineering process, and they've put an image in showing the countersink is. They've made good use of resources and references and so on. So following on from that, and there were several stages there, they've then said, I'm going to reduce this process from 16 processes to just 6. So they've reduced the number of processes, drilling and countersinking in one go, for example. So that's quite helpful. So they've done an initial of a business process, and they've made an improvement to the business process. So here's a copy of the assessment record. Now, this is a standard template. Again, this is on the website. You can access this, and it's also in the resource pack. There's details about the program title, the assignment title, the unit number. There's the learner name, the assessor name, the learning aim, deadlines and dates, and so on. Useful to point out that the deadline was the 19th and it was submitted on the 19th, so it's not a late submission, it's submitted on time. And here the teacher has awarded all of these criteria, okay? All of the criteria. So, and they've essentially said in the comments, you have identified necessary waste, you've reduced waste, your improvements are based on comprehensive mapping, you've evaluated the benefits gained. And then a general comment about the work being quite good. The rest of this is fairly standard. We'll talk about resubmissions in a minute. So the questions from the slide really was, as an IV, can you support those assessment decisions? So let's look back at the evidence again. So looking at the specification, did they comprehensively map a given business process? Yeah, I think they did that. Did they identify at least 4 non-value added steps? Yeah. Did they suggest improvements by making logical changes? I guess these blue elements would indicate that. And did they produce a flowchart that's logically structured? So that seems they're certainly at the merit standard, and the past standard will reflect that. Now, is there any evaluation there? Did they evaluate the benefits? Did they assess how reordering the steps using the same so that almost operation using the same machine and carry out together reduces unnecessary movement? Did they assess how altering the types of tool can reduce setup and processing time? Well, I don't think they really did here. They just changed the process, but there's no evaluation. So you as a assessor, or excuse me, as a verifier, have to think, I'm not sure this is the correct assessment decision. So I'm going to bring up the relevant document here. This is the assessment decisions document. So again, it has all the administrative information here. We won't fill all that in because that is just administrative. You put the learner name in here. So submission type, it was a first submission. List which assessment and grading criteria the assessor has awarded. So they awarded P1, P2, M1 and D1. It's not an accurate assessment decision. D1 was awarded incorrectly. And we'd say there's no evidence of evaluation. So, has every learner in the assessor confirmed the authenticity of evidence? Let's just go back to the check that. So there's a learner signature and a learner declaration, an assessor signature and an assessor declaration. That's all highlighted here. So we can go back to the IV document. Learner's name in there. So that was okay. Is there evidence? Oops, sorry, I put the wrong. Is there evidence of collusion or plagiarism? There wasn't any there. You could see. Does the assessment feedback to each learner link to relevant criteria? Well, it does. Justify each criterion awarded? Not really. Provide appropriate guidance? Not really. So general comment would be but here's the key part, the action. Now, this assessment decision awarded a distinction when we didn't think the distinction was appropriate. So we need to change this assessment decision, but we also need the assessor to look back at every distinction criteria they've awarded for this unit, because it's likely that it's not just this one that's incorrect. So I would put as an action here to review all distinction grades awarded for this assignment, and I'd perhaps have a target date of, let's have a look at when the original date was. So we go back to this document. So it was the 19th of October. So the target date might be that the tutor may well have had a, let's assume that they marked it on the 19th and you reviewed it on the 19th. So I would suggest maybe a week to go through all those assessments again. And it may be the case that the tutor actually completed that early for you. So this one we'd be left blank, and you would go back to the teacher, but then the teacher has then completed those actions. So at that point, I would then review that again. I might look at 2 or 3 distinctions to make sure they're all correct. And I would then sign that off. So you would set an action. You would then give that feedback to the assessor. they'd go back and review that, change their assessment decisions, and then you'd review it for a second time. And once you were happy, you'd then sign it off. Only when you've signed it off here would it be the case that you'd then allow those grades to be recorded and that feedback to be given to the learners. And if there was any dispute about that, if the assessor didn't agree with you, that's when perhaps you'd bring in the lead internal verifier to have a look and see what they thought. In my experience, generally speaking, that doesn't happen because um, once we've all made mistakes. When you make a mistake as a teacher and the IV points it out, you then, generally speaking, just go back and amend those assessment decisions. So if we just go back to the PowerPoint again, so we internally verified the assessment decisions, and we thought when we fed back to the assessor, look, there's no evidence of evaluation in there. You do need to look back at this and reassess the work. Hopefully that was useful because it gives you an idea of what the forms look like, what the feedback sheets look like, what you're looking for as an internal verifier. And, the focus is on the essential information for assessment decisions and assessment criteria, as we've been talking about throughout the presentation, really. Those are the sort of absolutely key elements that we always think about as we're assessing and verifying. Now, just something on resubmissions, actually, because we did touch on it. All resubmissions must be authorized by the lead internal verifier. Only one resubmission is possible per internal assignment. And these are the requirements. So before we go through the requirement, well, actually, we can go through the requirements so it all fits in. So has the learner met initial deadlines? So we would look to make sure that it's not been submitted late. Because if the work is submitted late, then you can't give them a resubmission. Unless you gave an extension as the teacher for some reason, in which case, obviously, it'd be reasonable. You as a teacher must be confident that that learner is able to provide improved evidence without further guidance. So if they submitted a piece of work that was entirely focused on the pass criteria and only met that pass criteria, and there was no attempt or even evidence to show that the learner could move on to merit and distinction, then you might decide a resubmission is not appropriate. Obviously, the paperwork has to be authenticated, so you want the learner to sign to say it's their own work, and you want the tutor to sign to say that it is not plagiarized. And then the student has an opportunity, has 15 days when they can resubmit evidence. Now, how that works is you would give the work back to the learner. They would obviously still have the brief, and you would say you've got an opportunity to resubmit to try and improve your evidence. And you've got 15 days to do that. And the student doesn't have to do the whole assignment again. They just have to add any additional elements they need in order to achieve possibly a higher grade. Now, you can't give them extra teaching or extra guidance. But for example, in the one we just looked at, you might decide that this was actually a pretty capable student, which given the evidence we looked at is evident. I think it was a well laid out flow charts. The thinking behind the changes was sensible. But in your feedback, this is where the feedback's important. You would say to the learner, you have not provided any evaluative evidence of the positive and negative aspects of making these changes. And then when the learner says, what do I have to do to improve the evidence, you would say to them, you need to provide that evaluation that you haven't done. Because all you're doing there is you're restating what the assessment criteria say. You're not giving them guidance on what to write, how to write it. You're just re-emphasizing the criteria to the learner. And those criteria are published and available to the learners anyway. So you're just emphasizing that. And that's the difference between sort of coaching a learner and giving them appropriate feedback. There's more information about resubmissions in the BTEC International Centre Guide to Internal Assessment, which is available via the links we've got here and on the website. But that 15-day rule is quite important. If they don't resubmit within 15 days, then the original grade, whether it be pass, merit distinction, or not achieved, would stand. And perhaps just a little bit more on that, where we have a process of, oh, sorry. I should also mention for the Pearson set assignment, the same rules apply. So if they've submitted the Pearson set assignment and they've perhaps achieved, let's say, a pass grade, and they were able to achieve a merit, then they can have a resubmission. And again, the 15-day rule applies. You'd have to set up the level of supervision necessary and have them have an opportunity to resubmit. Similarly, if the student submitted a piece of work that didn't achieve the pass level, so they've essentially, we say refer, which means they've not achieved yet, they can have an opportunity to get over the line with a pass. But if you do give them a resubmission and they don't resubmit the work, or if they were late submitting it and the work wasn't at a pass standard, that could potentially give them a problem achieving the qualification. So at the end of the semester, at the end of the program, the end of the year, if you're in that situation with the odd student, you can give them what we call a retake. Now, the retake is capped at a pass and has to be a new assignment, or if it's the Pearson set assignment, you would use the alternative one. If you remember, there are two live Pearson set assignments. So if you'd done the first one and they need to retake, you can give them the second one. If it's an authorized assignment brief, you'd have to just make a change to it. So it might be you'd have a different product, a different drawing, a slight change to make it a different assignment. And the student then has a second go at that, and you would only look at the pass criteria and you would cap it at a pass, assuming, hopefully they would get through it on that second attempt. All of that is scoped out in the Guide to Internal Assessment. It says 21, 22 on this slide. Obviously, there's a 2023, 24 version. The one relevant. It's republished each year, so there'll always be the most up-to-date version available to you. If you have any questions about how PSAs work, how internal assessment works, how to interpret engineering specifications, on the screen now is the subject advisor, a colleague of mine, Everin Alibaba. Everin is currently the person in role, but all those details are correct there in terms of getting help and support. You can contact Everin on that email address. There are support groups, and there's his phone number there. And what he'll often do is he'll book a 15-minute Teams meeting with you where he can go through any of your questions and queries, or if it's a specifically detailed query that he can't address, he'll pass it on to somebody like myself or another colleague who might have a specific knowledge of a particular unit, who can then give feedback. So that's a really useful support tool for you. If you're not sure about any part of the process in terms of delivering your qualification, Everin is your go-to person, and he can access all the different other subject experts and provide you with advice and guidance. Something else just to touch on, we are using Pearson Progress. Pearson Progress is an online platform used to support you as a centre. All the delivery and assessment can be presented on one platform. It allows you to set up assessments on there. It's got tracking, marking and feedback set up. Learners can upload their assessment evidence there. They can access their assignments and feedback using it. So it's a really useful remote tool that puts everything in one place. You don't have to use it, but I know that a lot of centres are using it when they, for example, when they seek approval to run qualifications. You have administrative rights as an assessor, so you can get in there and set up programs and set up assignments and so on. Issue assignment briefs through it and issue feedback to learners through it as well. Slightly different for learners. They can access all the program documentation on there, all the assignment briefs and specification and so on. They can manage their time with all the deadlines and assessments. They can upload assessment evidence to it, videos, documents, scans and so on. And then feedback, they can access the feedback from the assessors, but they don't have the same access rights as a teacher would have, for example, obviously. It's a free service provided to all approved centres. one of a key member of staff within your organisation will be set up with an account who can then share that out. And there are video recordings and training available. The link here takes you to a detailed look at Pearson progress. I'm obviously not going to go into that now because it's quite a long video. But that's useful to link onto. So the link is there for you if you want to have a look and see how it works. And that, folks, is nearly the end of the presentation. So just to recap, hopefully you've got an understanding of how the level 2 qualifications in engineering work now. Hopefully you'll be in a position where you can successfully plan your BTEC program. You can understand how you deliver engaging assessments. You've got an idea about quality assurance, IV, and the international standards verifier and their role. And I'm hoping that all the questions that you might have had have been covered. And obviously you can go back through the recording and pick up on any of the slides and hopefully just re-emphasize anything you might have missed as as gone through initially. What I'm going to do just before we finish off is I'm just going to stop sharing the presentation for a moment. I'm going to find the web page that I talked about, because we talked about a lot of information and documents and so on. And if I just find the correct web page for you, we can do that. In fact, I'll share the screen with you so that you can actually see me searching for it. It might be useful for you. So see if this brings up the right screen. Let's just here we are. So when you access the website, you can click, there's an option in the top right hand corner for UK and international. You can select the international option. You can then pick the qualifications tab and you'll find the specific group that you want, engineering, health and social care, whatever it might be. And then you can find the level that you're looking at. So this would typically be BTEC firsts. And then you can find the appropriate screen. And you'll find the specification, which was available to download, which we talked about. There's all the support for in terms of everyone's contacts and so on and so forth. And then there's support for teachers tabs with things like the resources that you can access, the authorized assignment briefs, all that sort of thing. And so on. So it's all there on the BTEC website. Just Google for BTEC, make sure you click on the international tab and you'll be able to pick up on all those resources that we talked about. In the resource pack that comes with it, there are templates for internal verification. There are templates for, there's the examples of the specification, the unit specifications and so on. There's a PDF of the slideshow, so you can go through that and pick up on the links and so on. So hopefully you'll be able to access a whole host of resources to help support you in your delivery of this program. So that's the presentation from me. Hopefully you found it useful, and perhaps I look forward to speaking to you in perhaps a face-to-face event in the near future. So goodbye for me, and thanks for listening.